Hello, everyone. My name is Chris McKenzie, and I'm the Senior Communications Director for Chamber of Progress, a center-left tech group devoted to a progressive society, economy, workforce, and consumer climate. Welcome to today's panel, Blocked: How Lawmakers Are Censoring Teens Online. Today, we're going to dive into some of the teen digital censorship laws passing in the states. We'll talk about similar legislation that's been proposed in Congress. We'll explore the political realities behind these legislative proposals, and we'll take a look at what to expect in 2024. As some of you probably know, today's panel follows a year in which a handful of state legislatures passed new laws limiting teen access to online platforms and resources. Beginning in Utah, state lawmakers passed legislation requiring minors up through the age of 17 to seek parental consent to spend time on social media sites. Utah's law was followed soon after by bills in Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Some of the bills went so far as to ban teen access to specific types of content. Others limited the hours in which teens could access online platforms. But all of these bills had one thing in common. They put up new barriers censoring what teens can see and say online. In September, Chamber of Progress released a new report examining the links between the right wing's curriculum censorship and book ban movement and the movement to pass teen digital censorship legislation. The report found that in state after state, the same far-right lawmakers, the same anti-LGBTQ organizations, and the same parental rights groups supported book bans and supported teen digital censorship legislation. You can find that report on our website. A link is in the comments section. During today's event, we're going to explore each of these themes in a little more depth. We'll have a conversation with our expert panelists, and then we'll turn to our attendees for some audience questions. But before heading to our panel discussion, I just want to open it up to our expert panelists to give an introduction of themselves. We're going to begin with Lee Rowland from the National Coalition Against Censorship. If you want to introduce yourself, Lee.
Sure. Hi, Chris, and thank you. Welcome to everyone. My name is Lee Rowland. I am the pretty new Executive Director of the National Coalition Against Censorship. We are a nonpartisan national advocacy group with a coalition of about 60 groups, from unions to civil rights groups to publishers to libraries, that stand up for free expression and fight the censors. We've been intimately involved in fighting the most recent scourge of book banning, along with several of my fellow panelists and their organizations as well. And I also come from a long background of First Amendment litigation. I've been a free speech attorney with the ACLU for almost 2 decades. So now I'm in the kind of direct advocacy space, but I'm coming to it with a long bit of First Amendment lawyering in my back pocket as well. Great to be here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lee. Next, we're going to turn it over to Cameron Samuels from Students Engaged in Advancing Texas.
Hi, everyone. I am Cameron. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a student organizer from Texas. I got involved in my school district organizing against an LGBTQ internet filter that prohibited students from accessing vital resources for queer youth, and also at the same time defending intellectual freedom against book bans that were rising in Texas. Now I lead a coalition of Students Engaged in Advancing Texas, which is abbreviated as SEAT. We're demanding a seat at the table in educational policymaking that impacts students, our futures. And that's all about me.
Thank you, Cameron. We'll go to Shay Gardner from LGBT Tech.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shay Gardner. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm the policy director for LGBT Tech, which is the largest national org working exclusively at the intersection of LGBTQIA+ issues and technology policy. Our community is some of the earliest adopters and the heaviest users of technologies. So we work to make sure that we're being considered and included in issues from connectivity to emerging technologies to privacy to censorship.
Thank you, Shay. We'll go to Dr. Taslin Magnuson.
Hello, it's great to be here today. Thanks for inviting me. I come at this in a very weird way. I started tracking book bans in the middle of the night and then began to become be in relationship with PEN America as a consultant to their Freedom to Read team, and then also with Every Library as a consultant in their work. So grateful to be here.
Thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate it. So we're going to start in with some questions for our panelists, but if you're attending this event and you have a question yourself, feel free to chime in by typing that into the comments section, and we'll get to those after we have a little bit of a panel discussion here. I want to kick off our panel discussion with a question for Lee. Across the country, states including Utah, Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana have enacted new legislation limiting teen access to the internet. Can you dive into what legislative mechanisms these laws use to block teen access to the internet, and how do these measures censor teen access to the online world?
Absolutely. And I'm not even sure, sadly, that's a complete list, but those are certainly the recent and the big ones. And all of those, the ones you've mentioned, have in common the Utah, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana laws are all different flavors of age verification laws that effectively put where the state has passed legislation that will require online sites, and they're slightly different versions of what kind of online sites. So, for example, Louisiana specifically targeting social media. The Texas bill specifically targeting adult and pornography sites. So they may have different exact reaches, but the mechanism is that those sites cannot permit minors, that is people under 18, from viewing that content without either explicit age verification processes and or parental consent. And the law, for example, in Arkansas, and there's another bill that's similar, might surprise you, comes from a blue state, but that I put in these buckets. California also has a new age verification law. Those laws basically kind of explicitly say that self-identified age is not enough. So many of us have become accustomed to those check boxes, right? When you get online, do you certify that you're at least 18? Many of these state laws go out of their way to say that's not going to cut the mustard here. You actually need to use a hard verification process. And this is either, again, in some states like the ones I just mentioned, it's for social media or it's for all websites or adult sites. But it actually requires that they use a third-party vendor in some states to actually create an age verification process. And there are so many reasons these laws are troubling. One of them, just to start, is they're often passed in the name of protecting kids, right? And protecting kids from objectionable content. And by the way, the mechanism of how we kind of limit access to the internet looks identical, regardless of the intent at the front end of the law. So, for example, the California law was passed largely driven by concerns about teenagers having access to information about eating disorders, misinformation about health, for example. The more red state laws were passed to keep kids away from sexual content and sexual material. But the actual mechanics of how you control and create an age verification screen on the front end end up being the same, which is to kind of decouple the freedom of the internet from the physical space where you live. So all of a sudden, the internet, which we think of as really crossing and transgressing our physical geographic borders, are being treated like states as though it's a floating ether cloud above the physical outline of the state of Arkansas, right? So that within Arkansas, what would govern these laws is an idea of what's appropriate within Arkansas. But of course, very few websites exist entirely in the state of Arkansas, you know, in the practical world. So number one, these laws actually require the collection of more data. Not just about minors, but about everyone. That keeps nobody safe, I guarantee you, particularly when the government is mandating new databases of information about you as the price of admission to find information online. That's number one. And number two, the implications for speech are massive. And unfortunately, although the safety of the kids, you know, is often the reason, the way these bills are sold, it doesn't just harm minors' access to the internet, it harms all of us, particularly when looking for sensitive content, whether that may be political, religious, the closest AA meeting, something about your sexuality, abortion access. all sites that are dealing now with sensitive material in states that have these laws will feel compelled to be asking you personal information to see if you are who you say you are and what age you are. That's true whether you're 17 or 30, because they don't know before you age verify which side of 18 you're going to be on. So these laws actually operate to really reduce the freedom that we have to access the internet. It eliminates the ability to search anonymously. And one thing that, a final thing I have to add here is that minors are not a monolith, right? What is appropriate content for a 3-year-old is wildly different from a 17-year-old on the cusp of legal majority who may be interested in finding out information about sexual orientation, consent, right? Abortion. 17-year-olds are right on the cusp of being full-fledged citizens, right? Or residents that we have all the legal duties and opportunities of adulthood. So nobody is born 17 springing forth from the forehead of Zeus, but these laws treat all minors the same, with the idea that until you turn 18, the internet needs to have a big black box warning on it. And that not only harms everyone's access to expression, it has uniquely acute impacts, which I know other panelists will talk about, particularly on the queer community, where folks are looking for access to information that may be harder to find, particularly in conservative, real world communities. And they also kind of create, frankly, a privacy issue and dragnet for all of us seeking to use the internet, and really eliminating our ability to get sensitive, political, critical information without the government mandating that our information be collected as the price to gain that knowledge.
Wow, those are all really good points. Thank you so much, Lee. The other thing I just wanted to chime in with really quickly is that age verification, one of the legislative mechanisms these bills use to censor teen access to the internet. Another, obviously, is parental consent. If any of our panelists want to chime in at all about how that sort of parental consent provision can limit access for teens online. Shay?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see that as kind of another one of these verification provisions, which really do fail to take into account youth that don't have a standard parental living situation, as well as youth that don't live in supportive homes, which particularly for LGBTQ plus youth is too often a reality. We know that only 40% of LGBTQ plus youth report living in supportive environments. So that's 60% who have to go somewhere to find the information in the community they're looking for. That also, it is another form, I think, of another major privacy concern. If you are requiring an online service to verify a relationship between a parent and a child, you are again asking, in the same vein as age verification, for very sensitive and personal information to be provided either to a platform or to a third party. So it obviously affects LGBTQ plus youth, but also externally, everyone.
Great. You just touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to follow up here. LGBT Tech recently organized a letter with 70 plus LGBTQ organizations highlighting how federal versions of these teen digital censorship laws would harm young LGBTQ plus people. Can you tell me more about how teen digital censorship legislation targets this community specifically?
Absolutely. To table set a little bit more, we estimate that there are more than 5.7 million LGBTQ plus youth between 13 and 17 in the United States. So that is a larger population than that of 29 of the 50 states. It is this massive demographic of youth who then have the additional unique challenge of potentially being discriminated against in their own home. And like I said, only 40% of LGBTQ plus youth say their homes are affirming spaces. You compare that to 68% who say that online spaces are affirming for them. And that number gets only more disparate for transgender youth in particular. So when youth don't have the sort of security, safety that they need at home, they will seek that out in online spaces. And that does help keep them happy, healthy, and alive. It also ties in with how members of our community do have demonstrably worse health and mental health outcomes than our peers. And that is particularly true for our youth. We know that visibility, community resources are our best tools in fighting this. And online spaces that provide that to a majority of our youth mean that we have to make sure legislation isn't even unintentionally reducing their access. That is an unintentional harm of some of the ambiguous language that's being used in these bills. There is, on the other side of it, a much more intentional harm that we have to be aware of that comes from policymakers who are actively looking to abuse the language of these bills to force censorship of LGBTQ plus content and prevent youth from accessing it. And when you have elected officials like Marsha Blackburn and Ted Cruz actively vocalizing that they see transgender content as harmful, and when you have the Texas Attorney General saying that he feels he has a duty of care to prevent children from having access to it, it becomes very easy to see how they would interpret and use harm prevention from these bills to harm us.
It's not a stretch. Yeah.
Chris,
Sorry, Lee, you wanted to chime in?
Thank you, Shay. That was perfect. And it made me think that although they aren't explicitly on our agenda, it's probably worth also mentioning there are 2 states that have passed laws that effectively ban content moderation by social media social media sites in Texas and Florida. And that is going up to the Supreme Court next session. And just as Shay was speaking about the importance of accessing spaces for, safety and community and information, particularly for LGBTQ plus folks, what the Supreme Court will be grappling with is almost the flip side. It also involves government attempting to tinker, right, with the mechanisms of social media and online sites. But in a case where 2 red states, passed these explicitly because they believe social media states were discriminating against conservative voices, and the effect, the kind of effective impact of those laws is that sites that do provide kind of safe spaces and have content moderation that, allows users of many different types to flourish, right, in an environment, they're actually now saying not only, right, these are 2 of the states that are involved in the same shenanigans on both sides, right? Not only are we going to collect all your data, right, reduce your access to the internet, but once you get there, we're going to make sure that social media sites also can't have takedown policies for hateful speech or harassment. So that's really a double whammy, I think, for vulnerable communities to be told you can't get online unless you could do it the way we tell you and we have all your data. And then once you get there, welcome to the cesspool. So those 2 things, although they're in slightly different areas, put together a pretty brutal picture of the government micromanaging the online environment in a way that's uniquely toxic for vulnerable youth.
That was really well put. Thank you. I want to turn to Cameron. Cameron has seen firsthand the impact of digital censorship and book bans. Cameron, if you could tell us a little bit about your experience in Texas. What are your thoughts on Texas's new law, HB 18, requiring parental consent in banning teen access to content deemed harmful for minors?
In Texas, there are so many policies in school districts and in the state government that are harming students, undoubtedly. In my school district in Katy, Texas, there was an internet filter prohibiting students from accessing the Trevor Project Suicide Prevention Lifeline, accessing the Human Rights Campaign's website with many resources and tools for making schools safer for queer youth. And at the same time, we see that book bans passed by the state legislature in Texas with House Bill 900. This has created a chilling effect in school districts across Texas, where school districts are going out of their way to so-called protect the children, to censor materials in libraries, on the internet. They're going out of their way to make these authoritarian policies that have actually nothing to do with parental choice, as they deem it so clearly. It is not about parental choice when it's about dictating what public schools are able to provide for students. These institutions, which should be devoted to students' welfare, students' achievement, excellence in life, preparing students to become leaders. And that doesn't work when we are denying students access to the resources that will best help them discover themselves and become true to themselves. these resources can be life-changing. Having access to a suicide prevention lifeline or seeing a block page that says that this website is prohibited because not harmful content, but because it's LGBTQ specifically. These internet filters are assigned to students that their schools are not safe, if they even were off the internet either. Policies like these were what I faced in high school, seeing that category of an internet filter, just speaking to me, the overt discrimination imposed by this. And as I've seen over the years, this was never really about the websites, the books. It was never about the content, but rather about the identity specifically. Because we see in the state legislature how the book ban, House Bill 900, and internet censorship with HB 18, these bills have very similar sponsorships. It's the same legislators that are pushing this narrative to censor. And it's the same chilling effect, the same funders of campaigns in local school districts that are fueling this effort to censor. And that has led to other state legislation like Senate Bill 763 that would allow school districts to replace counselors with religious chaplains. It's the same movement that has led my school district now, after it quote unquote solve the book issue, to now solve the trans issue, to now they created this policy in August and passed it very they just passed it so hastily. And it was a direct assault on trans students, has nothing to do with protecting children, but saying in the objectives of the policy to not allow the school district to teach about gender identity, gender fluidity, to teach about these concepts that differ from the status quo. And that very same status quo is one that is unjust. It's keeping students struggling in their schools, finding no trusted adults, finding no safe spaces. And this policy would ban gay-straight alliances. It would require teachers to out their students to their parents. And as we know, many families are not supportive of LGBTQ identity, and schools are often the only safe space they can find among their peers, if they even have accepting peers. And by creating internet filters that prohibit students from accessing these resources when counselors or chaplains cannot, when their teachers cannot provide that, when there are no books in the libraries that can provide that. The internet is one of those places that people can visit. It built upon those values of freedom and being able to create this democratic system where you can create on the internet and you can receive on the internet. And that is not upheld by censorship legislation, both on the school level and in state legislatures with HB 18, where it's framed as parental rights, but in reality, it's contributing to a students' rights crisis in Texas, where so many policy after policy after policy, these are targeting students' rights, our agency to hold the power in our own education. This is our life, this is our education, and the decisions that impact our everyday lives in school hallways, in classrooms, in libraries, on the internet even. These policies are not made by us. They're made without us. And that agency is so necessary to shape policy that does support students. When we have bills like HB 18 in Texas prohibiting students on their own to access services on the internet, parents are going to be the same people who could be speaking at school board meetings, spewing bigotry. These people might not be really supporting that broader perspective that the world can be, contributing to that extreme fringe narrative that is very narrow and not supporting students directly, about usurping control of that decision over their children. And children deserve the privacy. Children deserve the right to explore, discover themselves, and that's because it's their life. And having access to social media could be one great life-saving measure for queer students, especially, to access a community that's like them, a community that can offer them the support that they need. And in my school district, on a closing thought, it's this movement to censor that they contributed in blocking websites like the Trevor Project, upholding this internet filter with the intention to prevent grooming, possible grooming. They saw that trained certified counselors with the Trevor Project would be grooming children that would access these resources at such a vulnerable time. But in reality, students are vulnerable and they need resources like these. And that's why policies that censor the internet are overtly discriminatory, because they, as Senator Blackburn and Senator Cruz has stated over and over again, and pushing policy in that same rhetoric, these policies are an attempt to erase the most vulnerable people, most vulnerable youth, who should and most fervently maintain the power to make those decisions and access resources that they deserve.
Thank you so much, Cameron. Those are some really interesting points. You know, I really hear what you're saying about the compounding effects of some of these laws in a school where you're facing book bans, where your counselor is now your chaplain. The internet, in some cases, is kind of a last refuge of access to some of these resources. I want to turn now to Dr. Magnuson. You know, many of the teen digital censorship laws that passed in 2023 passed in deep red states that also led the charge for book bans. Could you tell us a little bit more about how book bans have been used to target marginalized groups, and how do new digital teen censorship laws in those states use similar tactics?
Great. I want to back up real quick and feed off of something that Cameron said, which is Cameron talked about the relationship of policy in the district, the Department of Education, and then overall legislation. And while we can certainly talk about deep red states leading the charge for book bans, we need to look at the deep blue states who we see kind of the inverse. I think they call it like grass top, dirt underneath, I'm not sure. But we see policies being changed at the district level across Pennsylvania, across Michigan, across Wisconsin, where similar policies and practices that they cannot legislate yet are being enacted at the district level. So censoring, there's the bathroom policies, there's sports policies for trans kids. There are plenty of digital filter policies, as Cameron addressed. So there's a whole rush of sort of a environment that is both chilling, censorish, and damaging to the young people that public education is supposed to support and approve and to nurture. The commonality that I really see between both the legislation and then this sort of amalgamation of policy and parents and parental rights run wild is they're all using the same rhetoric. They're like, they use the same lists for book bans. They use the same exchanges of information on Facebook and other social media. There's like a community that is devoted to using this parental rights to take away rights from young people and take away rights from other parents. And really what they are doing is creating structures and pathways to diminish access, to make it more frightening for teachers and librarians and students to be themselves, to teach what they believe is necessary, and also for librarians to have a robust collection that represents their community as they are trained professionals to do. And what this does then is it stigmatizes stories. And, first, I forgot to mention at the beginning, I'm trained as a kidlit author and a poet, But when we erase stories, when we tell people their stories don't matter, and in fact, they're problematic or they're not appropriate until they're being adult, we're erasing people. Where stories are core to who we are and how we talk about ourselves and how we learn about the world. And young people deserve their stories. And their stories are in fact created by authors, the ones that are being banned across the country, by authors who think profoundly about what it means to write for young people, to create worlds that they themselves were denied. And they are growing and expanding the world. And now we have a pushback, and a very hard pushback that is succeeding in deep red and deep blue states, but in very different ways that we need to be aware of and attack immediately. I mean, I could talk about these groups. I could talk about the importance of the authors, but I think most of all, I think we need to understand that the people who need to be at the table when we talk about education and our public spaces are not there, right? The students, young people. I was searching really quick, but in Matsu, an Alaska district, there's a student who spoke out. Most school boards have a student rep who serve in some form on the school board, and they're allowed a public voice as a representative of the students. In Matsu, the student rep pushed back against the rhetoric they were hearing and the conversation they were hearing, and then they removed the student rep position from the school board. There's some legislation impending in Matsu district in Alaska, but that's what's happening. It's about silencing stories, silencing opportunity, silencing access, and isolating and stigmatizing young people.
Thank you, Dr. Magnuson. No, I appreciate that. I want to remind all of our attendees as well, if you have questions for our panelists, please pop those into our chat. We're going to take a moment soon to turn to our audience questions. But first, I want to go to Lee. Again, many of the states which have enacted digital teen censorship have seen an onslaught of book bans over the past several years. What is your sense of how this combination of book bans and digital teen censorship laws impact students?
Oof, it is such a massive question. I mean, like Dr. Magnuson, I feel like I could wax on that for an hour. So let me try and control myself. The National Coalition Against Censorship was actually formed in response to a Supreme Court case about obscenity, Miller versus California, in the 70s. This is well before, the digital era. And one of the reasons a case about obscenity, right, attracted, I think, groups that are fairly mainstream, including children's publishers, right, and unions, is because what that case did in 1973, it's called Miller versus California, for the first time, was enable states to basically set local community standards of obscenity. And what obscenity looks like from state to state is wildly, wildly different. And one of the concerns we had is that localities would use their ability, to kind of call things obscene and hit too broad, be overbroad about it, right? And actually block access to the kind of content that, Cameron and Shay and Dr. Magnuson have explained is so crucial, particularly for older minors, getting close to adulthood. So the overlay here, I think, is really one of of policymakers trying to meld the kind of digital online environment into our existing First Amendment regime. And the First Amendment, we've gone this far without saying this. It's probably worth saying at a very basic level. The First Amendment is designed to protect speech from government overreach. And because we're all here, it is worth saying that in this year, 2023, very few people get their information from somebody standing on a street corner on a soapbox, right? That is not the model for where we interact and get information, right? The overwhelming majority of folks now access a lot of information that they need, not on a street or a park or a sidewalk, the places most protected by the First Amendment, but actually online. And that access is overwhelmingly controlled by private parties, right? I mean, we don't have public spaces online. And so the reality of this is that the Supreme Court, the First Amendment, have occasionally blocked states' kind of broad attempts to use obscenity under the guise of actually tackling controversial issues, queer issues, labeling gay speech pornographic or obscene, even though it's very similar to the same thing you'd see in a straight context, but just applied right to queer folks. And so I think the exact same incentives that have existed throughout the 20th century for identifying obscenity and using obscenity or harmful to minors as kind of a smokescreen for broader control of access to information, that scares people, particularly people I think that consider themselves conservative or regressive, right? Those pressures are greater for those folks with the advent of the internet. So I think when you see these censorious impulses to control access to information, to quote unquote protect the kids or enhance parental rights, in 2023, states can't do that if the steam valve of the internet exists. Now, I think of that as a feature, not a bug, right? I think that's our saving grace. Like, the 21st century has given us this freedom. And the Supreme Court has, at least prior versions of the Supreme Court, have struck down attempts to limit access to the internet, that the First Amendment freedoms still fully apply to government attempts to keep us offline, and they've explicitly upheld minors' rights to access the internet. For example, in striking down bans on violent video games in California, which the state tried to say, hey, minors don't really have First Amendment rights. So we have this robust legal regime. I think there are two things going on. Number one, we have a new Supreme Court, and there are lots of conservative states that are willing to try a test run at the Supreme Court and say maybe they'll think differently about obscenity. And this time, we're not just going to say it's about harmful to minors. We all know it's also about including more progressive content. That is, that all of a sudden queer content has been labeled pornographic or obscene. And so I think those same censorious impulses exist. They're willing to try the Supreme Court again, right? And so it's very little, it's not surprising at all to me that you're seeing digital and analog versions of these kind of culture wars to control information, to call our racial history divisive, right? To call queer theory and writing obscene. And those are terms of art, because those are the ways they can kind of mask the kind of, I think, pernicious intent of those laws, and take another run at the Supreme Court that's now more conservative and say, hey, give us more leeway to protect the kids, right? And in practice, we all know that means diminished privacy, diminished access for all of us, unique harms to LGBT communities, and racial justice language. But they're going to try and package this, right, as a new attempt digitally and in the real world to just protect the children. And I don't think any of us buy that on this call. But scarily, this is a Supreme Court that's going to be open to hearing those arguments. So this is a double-barreled approach. And again, no, not at all a surprise. We're seeing it on both fronts in many of the same states.
Thank you for that, Lee. We actually have some audience questions that are popping in now that I want to turn to. We have a couple from Danielle Draper and from Julie Gonin, both kind of addressing a similar issue, which is that some harmful content does exist online. So, if we don't support some of these solutions that we see passing in red states, what sort of solutions might be helpful for kids' mental health as, we live in this digital age? And I just want to start it off right here by saying that I think when thinking about the solutions that we need to be implementing to protect kids' health online, I forget who said this earlier on this call, but it's important to remember that kids aren't one monolith, right? That a 17-year-old is very different from an 8-year-old, and that a 17-year-old who is, say, part of a marginalized community has different needs to connect with peers who identify like they do online than, say, a teenager who is not part of that community. So I think that's really important to remember when talking about these solutions. I'll mention a few things that I think would be really helpful. Number one, I think it's critical that these laws in Florida and Texas that tie the hands of social media platforms when it comes to content moderation are struck down. Because if social media sites are going to moderate content and take harmful content down, take hate speech content down, even if it's a quote unquote political viewpoint, it can be hate speech. they need to have that legal ability to do so. And so the Texas and Florida lawsuits that you mentioned earlier, Lee, going to the Supreme Court, those will be critical to watch. The other thing I'd say is that our organization supports a nationwide privacy law protecting all Americans, regardless of age. If you institute privacy standards that apply to all internet users, then you no longer force the requirement that sites identify the age of users and institute some of these harmful age verification practices that Lee talked about earlier. And then the last thing I'll mention is that I think the landscape is actually changing currently as some lawsuits against large internet companies move through the courts. Right now, over the past year, we've seen 42 attorneys general launch lawsuits against social media platforms. We've seen a multi-district lawsuit for a number of school districts across the country, as well as personal injury lawsuits in states like California, all targeting a very similar thing, which is so-called addictive features on social media platforms. And basically, those lawsuits look to find a way around Section 230 to hold internet companies liable for some of the features that they have, like scrolling features, or the fact that whether or not they have timeout features. And so far, those lawsuits have moved forward in court, which to me says that it is possible that we have a little bit of a different landscape if these lawsuits are successful and find a way to hold these social media companies liable without changing the law necessarily. I'll pass it along to anyone who wants to take that question. What sort of solutions might be productive?
I'll jump in here and say it's a little outside of the legislative framework, but looking at the platforms specifically, one of the things that we think platforms can do best to provide a safe but relatively autonomous experience to youth is through the creation and application of very user-centric features that kind of empower those users. So I will wax poetic about the importance of having kind of customizable and enhanced tools like muting and blocking, the filtering of words and phrases, which really allow a youth to be able to go on there and specifically say, this one term is being used against me, or I'm being dead named, or whatever it is, and able to specifically kind of filter that out of their experience, as well as the creation of sort of youth-specific spaces and youth-specific features and age-appropriate spaces and forums. So that's obviously a very general answer, not comprehensive, but there is a lot that can also be done on the platform side.
Thank you. That's a good point. Dr. Magnuson?
I guess what I can offer best here is what I say to parents who talk to me about this sort of similar issue in book bans. I invite them to listen to the young people in their lives. And to understand the community forms different than when we were young. Community and connections and experiences are different. I think I spend a lot of time talking to a worried mother contingent often on, and it's really important that we stop talking and we start listening to young people because we don't understand, and so thus we react often in increasingly negative fashion, even if we are supportive of young people's freedoms. And so I just want to throw that onto the table.
And Chris, if I can add one more small anecdote. I saw the question in the queue kind of started with the assumption that, unfettered access online is in fact harmful. And I just want to say, look, the internet is terrifying. I'm old enough to have grown up in the analog world, and I really believe that it amplifies everything about the human experience, and that applies to good things or bad things. And I think because of the speed and access we have, I think all of us on a human level are kind of very fearful or open to the idea that that amplification is always negative or often negative. And in fact, the American Psychological Association put out a kind of mass health advisory on social media use in adolescence. And despite the title being a social media advisory, and this is very recent, by the way, this very large group study, the actual conclusion was that using social media is not inherently beneficial, nor harmful to young people, that adolescents' lives online reflect and impact their offline lives. And it very often, depends on the adolescent development level, which is gradual and continuous and for different communities. One of the statistics that's quite astounding, especially in light of what Cameron said, is that particularly for queer teenagers, they reported that suicidal ideation or thoughts went down dramatically when they had access to queer-friendly spaces. And again, going to the importance, as Shay noted, of creating spaces that can content moderate and can create, spaces for people to learn and explore. So it is scary. I am a First Amendment attorney for life. I would be the last person to get on here and say words don't matter and words can't harm. Of course, they're powerful as hell. That's why those of us in the free expression world do what we do. But the power of those words has the potential to be as positive as it is negative. And that has been true for the entirety of human experience. So do good people, from all walks of life want to protect kids in some way? Yes. But I would urge people not to assume that that inherently means we need to reduce access to information, just like the prior panics over violent video games, just like, kind of the fear that people would become addicted to porn. No peer-reviewed or reliable studies have actually borne those out. People generally seek the information that reflects the needs in their lives, and it is just as likely to have good or bad impacts as the analog speech we all experience when we're walking around the world. So I just think, you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to the APA, but the idea of kids accessing the internet has not itself created a massive psychological harm that is categorically different from the generation that came before.
This is all very well put. Thank you. Yeah, and that study you mentioned, I believe that was the Oxford Institute study, one of the biggest studies of internet use that's ever been done. I want to turn to another attendee question here. Feel free to chime in. What trends do you expect in 2024, and which states are you watching? Anyone want to take that? Shay?
Yeah. I could jump in first. I think looking towards 2024, the first big thing that we have to anticipate is existing bills like Utah's potentially coming into effect. So we're going to see in real time the implications of reduced access on platforms and the effect that will have on their most vulnerable users. And we need to be prepared to mitigate those harms to our communities as best possible. I think following that, the second thing we need to be looking for is and prepared for is a copycat effect. If other policymakers see these implications in action and they like what they're saying and they like these harms that are being caused, we're going to see mimicry around the United States. And finally, I think we are going to see, as we've talked about before, these attempts, these physical book ban attempts being very much replicated in digital spaces under the guise of sort of curation and the same language around prevention of harm to minors or prevention of harmful materials. And without calling out any states in particular for that, I will say, I think the best thing all parties involved can do is make efforts to stay engaged and informed, particularly as the news cycle in 2024 gets incredibly inundated with election news and there's less eyes on individual states. We need to make sure ours are there.
Thank you so much for that, Shay. And I think one of the things that I'm curious about hearing from some of our panelists about as well is that one of the laws that we mentioned, the Arkansas law, was actually struck down by a federal or put on pause by a federal judge for being unconstitutional and violating the First Amendment. Do folks have any expectation of whether that will impact the number of states who've expressed interest in passing similar parental consent and age verification requirements, whether that will have any, impact on this state level trend next year?
I wish I would say yes, but I'm a little more skeptical. As someone who's worked in state policy for the last 5 years, I've been leading legislative work for the ACLU of New York. California and Texas just clearly stand out as the bellwethers. And that's an embarrassing thing for me to admit, by the way, as a New Yorker, that even here in Albany, in our state house, if California does it, we want to do it too. And I worked for years in Nevada in more conservative legislators, which it was at the time. If Texas does it, we want to do too. They really operate as bellwethers. So right now, the legal landscape is a mixed bag. One of Texas's laws was actually reinstated last week by a court. So it's not easy to look at one unclear line. And as someone who's litigated these cases, I literally litigated an age verification case in Louisiana in like 2012, and we won and got fees. And I think they've tried to pass 3 since then. So, you know, as someone who's been in the law, we need lawyers. Thank you, civil rights lawyers. So don't take this the wrong way. They're necessary. They're nowhere near sufficient, right? We actually need to be activists. We need to be supporting people on the grassroots level, as my fellow panelists all wonderfully do. We need to be building a muscle memory so all people, policymakers, all of us, but youth, the people who are targeted in the kind of moral punching bag for reducing all of our access, actually understand these as values, because the law alone is never going to save us. No matter how robust the First Amendment is, no matter how many times these laws have been knocked down by the courts, they come up again. And they come up again either because lawmakers don't care that they're going to lose in court. They pass them in hopes that while they're in place, people will self-censor and they'll achieve the results that the First Amendment should have prevented, or they pass them in hopes that a brand new minted Supreme Court will take a different tack. So I hope the First Amendment work stays robust and we hold the line, but censorship still happens. So we need to educate people. We need to be active at the local level, get engaged in these fights, speak about them, go out, use your voice, because otherwise we kind of are in this rotating wheel where censorship is such an addictive and attractive tool to control the public conversation. It'll keep happening, and it will keep happening unless and until we have enough of a groundswell and a muscle memory for free expression to say enough.
And as long as extremism has a stronghold on school boards financed by political action committees, by this movement to censor, this is creating a stronghold throughout these states. It's creating differences among states where half of the country is one way, is the alternative reality to it. And that's creating different lived experiences for students and educators across those state lines. And until we have bellwethers of institutes like big tech and other bellwethers to establish what is a good solution, we're only going to see this extremism grow, because they are winning. This stronghold on school districts is happening very clearly in Texas. It's happening in these very diverse communities, but where that division is very clear, where it's a hotbed for this extremism, and it's all about taking away the power from those who are the biggest stakeholders. These decisions are being made by people who aren't in the school system, who don't have those high stakes, but they're making these decisions because it's this movement fueled by one narrative. And it's a copycat effect across the state, where we're seeing those policies just mirror each other in Texas, with one school district after the other copying those policies, and to a stronger effect than before. And that's only going to continue in the coming year. It's going to become a divisive issue in the next year in the more mainstream because of the election, as we've been discussing. And we have people who are calling for the abolishment of the Department of Education, other foundations of education like public schools versus a private school that can openly discriminate against particular groups of students, aka LGBTQ students. We have this movement that's not only censoring, but is diminishing the very foundation of education and other systems that are supposed to support teens, that are supposed to support the community and its stakeholders, but instead are favoring that fringe narrative.
And
Thank you,
Cameron, so well said. And I just want to add that a lot of the book challenges in my mind are heavily correlated with movements of folks who would happily end public education, who would be happy to see towns without public libraries, right? Because those are places that represent places of learning and exploration, which can inherently be a threat. So I would say, you know, two things I would advise people heading into an election year. Remember the importance of your public institutions, their value. Hold events at a library, attend your local library board meetings, stand up for its budget. Like, this kind of direct action actually matters. And the school board and school district world has really been politicized, and often really by one side, largely voices coming from the right who are interested in decreasing the, amount of expression. Don't wait until your ox is gored, until the book you love is gone from the library to show up at a district meeting and say, actually, diversity is good. It helps members of the community. It increases everyone's test scores to be, and odds of success to be exposed to diverse materials. Be a voice for that. And the other thing, and forgive me if this is a little bit like, finger waggy, is that free expression issues are just hard. I think they're at odds sometimes on a principled basis with our kind of core human instincts. And for people on this call who may consider themselves progressive or be on the left, which I suspect is most of you seeing where we are, you're gonna gnash your teeth in the most virulent frustration over misinformation and political deep fakes and people kind of, in your view, likely abusing their free speech online, right? The election years are hallmarks of this. And I just want to say, I suspect lots of the folks in California and soon to be copycat states like New York that want to pass these age verification laws to protect kids from misinformation, to protect kids from, information about anorexia, the mechanisms they're using are the same. So as a free expression expert, kind of lifelong person, the one thing I often struggle with is it's hard to maintain that principled stance when the people talking are people you disagree with and you think they're causing harm. So I would just, if anybody has it in them, take a little piece of this with you and remember, I hate what they're saying, right? But in order to ensure we're all free and we actually all live in an open society, I'm not going to try and shut them up. I'm not going to agree with the censors. I'm going to find a way to have a free and open dialogue, to get involved, to speak back, to content moderate in a way where other voices can be heard. And that's a tall order for us. Again, I think it's against human nature, but it's why we see these threats not exclusively coming from red states or blue states, is because censorship is really attractive when you hate the other side's argument. So if we can all find a little piece of our muscle memory to resist that, it would be a victory.
I'm going to come back to everyone for closing thoughts here because we are wrapping up. I will come back to all of you.
That was mine, Chris, so I don't need to take another minute.
Okay, but before I do, I just want to hit this last one audience member question, and we can put this to Dr. Magnuson. What are your thoughts on legislation banning books next year? I've heard states and federal attempts. If you could just quickly summarize what you're hearing for next year.
Is it I saw that question. Are they asking about states preventing book ban?
No, I think they're asking about states pursuing book bans.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming.
Oh, preventing book bans. I'm sorry.
That's almost a whole nother session to talk to. I think it's complicated and difficult. And I will do like that really panelisty thing and flip back to something Lee said, which is, I think we must, I tell this to parents and community members all the time, you must speak positively, proactively, and publicly a lot about the values that you need and want. So like, I have learned legislation moves slowly, response to legislation moves even slower. Your job as a person in your community is to get there, get to that public space and speak for it and speak positively. You don't need to answer the crazy. They have every right. I tell my board members in my own school board, you're at an open mic, like just let them say whatever they want to say. If they want to read sex passages for the next 10 minutes, go ahead. Like it's open mic time. It's public response. You need to be there too. You need to be there speaking for the values that you need and demand and want for the children and people in your community. And that's like your job. If I had to send you away from anything, and that will help all of this. I hope. I hope. I too am very skeptical and a little bit cynical because it's not really about the books. It's about controlling information, controlling who we are, controlling how we are in our world. So speak for what you believe in.
Thank you for that. All right, we're going to turn to Cameron first for just a brief closing remarks.
Absolutely. It's not about the books or the content, but it is about control and people's lives. Social media is not a monolith, just like how students are not a monolith. The use of social media varies depending on who is using it. And that means we can't treat it as a one-size-fits-all situation. We have to look at these constructive solutions, not restrictive ones, because censorship is not along party lines. Though there are, of course, trends, as we've seen in the last couple of years, especially. But as we've also seen from the federal government, there is a push both in Congress, the executive branch, about the use of social media for teens, the health implications. And when we're looking at health, of course, we've just spoken about this here, LGBTQ youth need access to platforms like social media and the internet to get those resources, to find that community where they can't find it. That is a paradox. That is so different for LGBTQ youth than it is for people who might be battling anorexia and seeing social media take the health implications there, or seeing addiction become fueled by social media use with endless scrolling and algorithms that promote addiction. So we can't use a one-size-fits-all situation to a solution to solve all of these issues. But what we can do is make those policies that are very user focused, user-focused, student-centered or youth-centered in the sense of this conversation, where it's promoting the best interest of students, of youth individually, and having that power to set those limits, to have algorithms, if there's constructive policies, legislation to promote better algorithms, that can take place without having to restrict content that is deemed harmful. Because in this closing thought, what is deemed harmful is very inherently political right now. There is no clarity in what is deemed harmful, what is deemed supportive for youth. It is very subjective. It is very politically driven by who is in charge, reinforcing that unjust status quo. And that's why we need solutions that can create that clarity, but also bring the power not to the government or to policymakers, decision makers who are over people, but instead give that power to the community, to the people who are those primary stakeholders who are directly impacted by these policies.
Thank you so much, Cameron. We'll go to Shay now.
Okay, very briefly, I will end with a bit of sort of a personal experience that relates. I was 15 when I first used a library computer to search, is it okay to be gay? It was online spaces that let me see people and hear stories that I resonated with. And ultimately, it was online spaces that first taught me that there was nothing wrong with me. So when nearly half of LGBTQ plus teens have considered suicide and the support in homes and communities just too often isn't there, this is the reason we push so hard against digital censorship. So I will end by saying this. If we sound emotional, it's because we are. We're talking about, yes, keeping LGBTQ plus and other marginalized youth socially engaged, but we're also talking about keeping them alive.
Thank you for that. Dr. Magnuson.
I really couldn't say it any better than that. It really is about young people, keeping young people alive, keeping young people healthy and connected, and teaching the truth of the past.
Lee, I know you said your bit, but okay. Well, listen, thank you so much.
That was beautiful, and Shay, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this panel. And thank you to our panelists. I really appreciate you all taking the time today to have this really important conversation.